What if everything we know about human history is wrong? Hidden beneath the dusty hills of Turkey lies a mystery so shocking it has forced scientists to completely rewrite the story of human civilization. Massive stone temples carved with impossible skill, built by people who supposedly had no cities, no farms, and no knowledge of how to move 10-ton stones with pinpoint accuracy. The site is 6,000 years older than the pyramids. And here's the strangest part. The people who built it buried it on purpose, hiding their masterpiece from the world. Who were these forgotten builders? And what were they trying to tell us? The year was 1994. A Kurdish shepherd was walking his flock across the barren hills of southeastern Turkey near the ancient city of Urfa. As he passed by an old mulberry tree, a tree the locals believed was sacred, he heard something. The bells on his sheep were tinkling in an unusual way. He looked down and saw something sticking out of the dusty ground. Strange, flat stones, too many to be natural. The shepherd didn't know it yet, but he had just stumbled upon one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time. When word reached the museum curators in nearby Urfa, they knew this might be special. They contacted the German Archaeological Institute in Istanbul. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was sent to investigate. Schmidt had spent years studying ancient sites in this region. He knew what to look for. When Schmidt first arrived at the hill in late 1994, he was skeptical. The site had actually been noticed before, back in the 1960s, during a survey from the researchers from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University. But those earlier archaeologists had dismissed it. They looked at the broken slabs of limestone scattered on the surface and assumed it was just an old medieval cemetery. Nothing special, nothing worth digging up. But Klaus Schmidt saw something different. The gentle rounded shape of the hill itself caught his attention. In Turkish, the locals called it Göbekli Tepe, which means potbelly hill because of its bulging shape. To Schmidt's trained eye, that rounded top didn't look natural. It looked like something humans had made. Schmidt later said, "As soon as I got there and saw the stones, I knew that if I didn't walk away immediately, I would be there for the rest of my life." He couldn't walk away. The stones were calling to him, whispering secrets from a forgotten age. So, in 1995, Schmidt and his team began digging. What they uncovered in those first months shocked everyone. Just beneath the surface, they found enormous stone pillars arranged in perfect circles. These weren't rough boulders. They were carved in incredible precision into T shapes, like giant stone letters standing upright. Some of these pillars were 16 feet tall and weighed between 7 and 10 tons. That's heavier than 2 full-grown elephants. The pillars were covered with detailed carvings of animals. Foxes prowling across the stone, lions frozen in mid-roar, scorpions with their tails raised to strike, snakes slithering in endless spirals, vultures spreading their wings wide, wild boars, gazelles, spiders, and creatures that seemed to dance across the ancient limestone. This wasn't the work of simple people scratching pictures into rocks. This was art. This was skill. This was mastery. But here's what made every archaeologist in the world sit up and take notice: the carbon dating results. When Schmidt's team tested organic materials found at the site, burned wood and animal bones buried in the structures, the results came back. The site was approximately 9,500 years old. Some estimates pushed it back even further, closer to 11,500 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9,500 years before the Common Era. That's more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge was erected in England. It's 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt rose from the desert sands. This temple was ancient when the ancient world was still young. The archaeological community was stunned. Some refused to believe it at first. How could hunter-gatherers, people who were supposed to be living in small, wandering groups, scraping by day to day, create something this complex?
According to everything archaeologists thought they knew, civilization worked like this. First, humans learned to farm. They planted wheat and barley, domesticated animals, and settled down in villages. Only after they had steady food supplies did they have time to build temples and develop religion. Survival first, spirituality second. But Göbekli Tepe flipped that story completely upside down. This was a massive, sophisticated religious center built by people who had not yet invented farming. They didn't have metal tools. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't even have pottery yet. The discovery left one archaeologist after another shaking their heads in disbelief. As one scientist put it, this shouldn't exist. So what exactly did Klaus Schmidt and his team find buried beneath that Turkish hillside? What does Göbekli Tepe actually look like? Imagine standing at the center of one of these ancient stone circles. All around you, massive T-shaped pillars rise from the ground, forming a ring. The pillars are arranged with incredible precision, each one carefully placed to create a perfect circle. The circles range in size. Some are 30 feet across. Others stretch to 100 feet in diameter, bigger than most modern houses. The T-shaped pillars themselves are mysterious. At first, they might seem like abstract shapes, just stone blocks carved for structural reasons. But archaeologists believe they represent something much more meaningful. The T-shape is actually a stylized human figure. The vertical shaft is the body. The horizontal top is the head and shoulders. Some of these pillars even have arms carved into them, bent at the elbows with hands meeting at the front as if they're protecting something or perhaps praying. At the center of each circular enclosure stand two larger pillars. These central pillars are taller than the rest, sometimes reaching 18 feet high. They face each other like silent guardians, watching over the space between them. The way they're positioned gives the feeling of a doorway, a threshold between our world and something beyond. Surrounding these circular enclosures are stone walls, roughly 6 feet high. These walls seem to enclose the sacred space, separating it from the outside world. Some walls have carefully carved portholes, small openings just big enough for a person to crawl through. Were these entrances for ceremonies? Did people have to symbolically enter on their knees, showing humility before entering the sacred circle? Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that what we can see today is just a tiny fraction of the site. Beneath the surface, at least 16 more stone circles are waiting to be uncovered, buried across 22 acres. The excavation that has happened so far covers less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe. Archaeologists could spend the next 50 years digging here and still not reveal everything. But it's the carvings on these pillars that truly capture the imagination. This is where Göbekli Tepe transforms from impressive architecture into something that speaks across thousands of years. The animals carved into the stone are rendered with stunning detail. These aren't primitive stick figures. The sculptors understood anatomy, movement, and life. A fox's tail curves with the natural flow of fur. A lion's muscles bunch beneath its stone skin, frozen mid-pounce. Birds spread their wings in flight, their feathers individually carved. Snakes are everywhere at Göbekli Tepe. They slither up the sides of pillars, coil around edges, and twist through abstract patterns. In ancient symbolism, snakes often represented transformation, rebirth, and hidden knowledge. Their ability to shed their skin made them symbols of renewal.
Vultures appear frequently too, especially on one pillar that archaeologists call the vulture stone. These aren't friendly birds. Vultures are scavengers, eaters of the dead. In many ancient cultures, vultures were associated with death rituals and the journey of the soul after death. Some researchers believed Göbekli Tepe might have been a place where sky burials took place, where the dead were left for birds to carry their remains into the heavens. Scorpions crawl across the stone, their tails curved and ready to strike. Wild boars charge forward with their heads down, looking aggressive and dangerous. There are lions, the ultimate predators, symbols of power and dominance. There are gazelles and wild sheep, the prey animals that sustained human life. One of the most mysterious carvings shows a headless man. His body is clearly male, with certain features deliberately emphasized. But where his head should be, there's nothing, just empty space. Above him, a vulture spreads its wings. Near him, a scorpion raises its tail. What does this scene mean? Is it a story of death? A warning? A myth captured in stone? Scholars have debated this endlessly. Some think it shows a ritual killing or sacrifice. Others believe it represents a transformation, a spiritual death and rebirth. Still others see it as a record of an actual historical event, something the builders witnessed and wanted to remember forever. Throughout all these enclosures, there's a pattern. Each circle seems to have its own animal theme. One enclosure is dominated by snakes. Another features foxes prominently. One circle belongs to the wild boars, another to the birds. As if each circle was built by a different group, and each group chose its own animal symbol, its own totem. This gives us a clue about who built Göbekli Tepe. It wasn't one single tribe working alone. This site required cooperation among many different groups of people, possibly coming from distances of many miles away, bringing their own identities, their own symbols, and working together on something bigger than any one tribe could create alone. And here's what's truly remarkable. This isn't just a temple. This is a gathering place, a ceremonial center, a place where separate groups of humans came together to celebrate something they all believed in. At a time when humans supposedly hadn't yet figured out how to farm or build permanent cities, they were already building cathedrals on hilltops. Klaus Schmidt believed that Göbekli Tepe was humanity's first cathedral on a hill, a holy site that drew pilgrims from across the region. The site sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent,
that arc of mild climate and good land, stretching from the Persian Gulf to Egypt. This was a paradise for hunter-gatherers. Wild wheat and barley grew here naturally. Herds of gazelles migrated through in massive numbers. Rivers flowed with fish. Nut trees provided food. The land was generous. But Göbekli Tepe itself shows no signs of permanent habitation. Schmidt's team found no cooking hearths where families would prepare meals, no houses where people lived, no trash pits filled with everyday garbage, no clay figurines of the type that littered domestic sites nearby. What they did find was evidence of feasting. Thousands upon thousands of animal bones, butchered and cooked. Bones of gazelles, wild boar, deer, geese, ducks. These animals were hunted, brought to the hilltop, and eaten in great communal meals. This was a place people visited for ceremonies, for celebrations, for something sacred. They came, they worshipped, they feasted, and then they left.
The implications of this are staggering. Religion came first, before cities, before farming, before pottery, before metal. Humans were building temples to their gods before they built permanent homes for themselves. This flips the old story on its head. Maybe we didn't get organized and then invent religion. Maybe religion is what made us organized in the first place. Maybe the need to come together to build sacred spaces, to honor something greater than ourselves, is what taught us how to cooperate in large numbers. Maybe faith built civilization. The mystery deepens when we ask the simplest question: who built Göbekli Tepe? According to archaeological evidence, the builders were hunter-gatherers. They lived around 9,500 years before the Common Era, at the end of the last ice age, in a period called the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A. This was the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution, the time when humans were just beginning the long, slow transition from hunting and gathering to farming and settlement. But here's the problem. Hunter-gatherers aren't supposed to be able to do this. Think about what building Göbekli Tepe required. First, you need to find the right kind of stone. The builders used limestone, which was readily available in the hills around the site. Limestone is relatively soft when first quarried, which made it easier to work with stone tools. But even soft stone requires incredible effort to shape. The builders had to quarry these massive blocks from the bedrock. Using only stone hammers and wooden wedges, they carved enormous pillars directly from the hillside. Some of these pillars weigh 10 tons. That's 20,000 pounds, and they had to be moved. How do you move a 10-ton stone without wheels, without metal tools, without domesticated animals to help pull? The builders used human muscle. According to experiments based on similar monuments, it would take dozens of people just to transport one pillar a short distance. Some researchers estimate it would require 50 to 75 people working together for weeks just to move a single pillar from the quarry to the building site. And then, once the pillar arrived at its destination, it had to be erected. These pillars weren't laid on the ground. They were planted upright, standing like sentinels. This required digging deep holes, carefully positioning the base of the pillar,
and then slowly levering the massive stone into a vertical position without letting it crack or topple. After all that physical work came the art. Someone had to carve those intricate animal reliefs, using flint tools, chipping away bit by bit, shaping foxes and lions and snakes with such detail that you can almost see them breathe. This wasn't quick work. This took hours upon hours of careful, patient craftsmanship. Now multiply all of that effort by the dozens of pillars in each enclosure. Multiply it again by the multiple enclosures across the site. Add in the walls, the floors, the smaller stones, the architectural details.
Klaus Schmidt estimated that building Göbekli Tepe would have required hundreds of people working together, not just for a few weeks or months, but for years, possibly decades. And these weren't just laborers. These were skilled craftsmen, people who understood stone, people who could envision what the final structure would look like and execute that vision with precision. This requires organization. It requires planning. It requires leadership. Someone had to coordinate all these different groups, assign tasks, manage the work. Someone had to know how to quarry stone, how to move it, how to carve it. Someone had to design the circles, decide where each pillar would go, ensure everything fit together properly. This level of coordination suggests a complex social structure. There were probably specialists, people whose job it was to carve stone, others whose job it was to organize labor. There might have been religious leaders, shamans or priests who directed the sacred aspects of the work. And all of this was done by people who supposedly lived as simple hunter-gatherers, wandering from place to place, living in temporary camps, never staying anywhere long enough to build something permanent. Except they did build something permanent. They built Göbekli Tepe. So how is this possible? Where did they learn these skills? This is where the mystery takes an intriguing turn. Some researchers wonder if the builders of Göbekli Tepe inherited knowledge from somewhere else, from someone else, from an earlier civilization that has been lost to history. Think about it this way. If you wanted to teach someone how to build Göbekli Tepe today, starting from scratch, with no previous experience, how long would it take them? How many mistakes would they make? How many attempts before they figured out the right techniques? But there's no evidence of mistakes at Göbekli Tepe. The pillars are precisely carved from the beginning. The circles are laid out with geometric accuracy. The carvings show masterful skill. It's as if the builders already knew exactly what they were doing. Where did that knowledge come from? Some alternative researchers have proposed a controversial idea. What if before the hunter-gatherers of Göbekli Tepe, there was an earlier civilization, a civilization that existed during the Ice Age, perhaps along coastlines that are now underwater, drowned when the glaciers melted and sea levels rose? What if survivors from that older world, fleeing floods and climate catastrophe, moved inland and brought their knowledge with them? What if they taught the local hunter-gatherers how to work stone, how to build monuments, how to organize on a grand scale? This is speculation, of course. Mainstream archaeology doesn't accept this idea because there's no direct evidence of such an earlier civilization. No cities have been found beneath the ocean.
No ruins have been discovered that predate Göbekli Tepe. But the question remains, how did people with Stone Age technology suddenly develop the knowledge and skill to build one of the most sophisticated temples in the ancient world? Some researchers point to other anomalies in the ancient world. There are megalithic sites scattered across the globe, massive stone structures whose construction still puzzles engineers today. In Malta, there are underground temples carved from solid rock. In Egypt, there are precision-cut stones weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together so perfectly that you can't slip a knife blade between them. In South America, there are massive fortress walls made of irregularly shaped stones that somehow lock together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Could there be a connection? Could all these sites share a common origin, a shared inheritance of knowledge from a lost source? This is where mainstream science and alternative theories part ways. Traditional archaeologists say no. Each culture developed independently. Each site was built by the people who lived there, using their own innovation and determination. Alternative researchers say maybe. Maybe there's a thread connecting these ancient mysteries, a hidden history we haven't fully uncovered yet. For now, all we can say for certain is this. The people who built Göbekli Tepe possessed knowledge and skills that surprise us. They were far more capable than we ever imagined ancient humans could be. And that means we still have much to learn about our own past. The builders of Göbekli Tepe remain, in many ways, forgotten. We don't know their names. We don't know their language. We don't know what they called themselves or what stories they told around their fires. But we know they were here. We know they built something magnificent, and we know they wanted it to last forever. To understand Göbekli Tepe, we need to understand the world it was built in. And that world was changing in dramatic, terrifying ways. 11,000 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the last ice age. For thousands of years, massive sheets of ice had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. In some places, the ice was more than a mile thick, crushing the land beneath its weight. But around 10,800 years before the Common Era, something happened. The climate began to warm rapidly. The glaciers started melting. And when glaciers the size of continents melt, the water has to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels rose dramatically, perhaps as much as 300 to 400 feet over the course of several thousand years. Coastlines that had been home to humans for generations disappeared beneath the waves. River valleys flooded. Entire landscapes were swallowed up by the sea. This wasn't a slow, gentle process. There were catastrophic floods, sudden surges when ice dams broke and released millions of gallons of meltwater all at once. The Black Sea might have been filled in a single massive flood event. The Persian Gulf, which had been a fertile river valley, was drowned. The Mediterranean coastlines shifted dramatically. If there were human settlements along these coasts, and there almost certainly were, because coastlines offer abundant food and resources, those settlements are now underwater, buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. Any evidence of who lived there, what they built, what they knew, is gone, hidden beneath the sea. This was a time of massive population displacement.
People who had lived along the coasts for generations had to move. They had to migrate inland to higher ground, carrying whatever knowledge and culture they possessed with them. Now imagine you're a survivor of this world-changing catastrophe. Your homeland is gone, flooded by rising seas. Your ancestors lived in villages along the coast, maybe even built impressive structures, practiced advanced skills. But all of that is lost now, claimed by the water. You and your people move inland. You find new lands, encounter new tribes, and you bring with you the knowledge of the old world. You remember how your ancestors worked stone. You remember the sacred practices, the religious beliefs, the stories of gods and catastrophes. Is it possible that Göbekli Tepe was built by refugees from a drowned world? People who carried with them the memory and knowledge of an earlier time.
This is where the idea of a lost civilization connects to Göbekli Tepe. Not that aliens built it, or that magic was involved, but that humans with sophisticated knowledge existed before the history books currently acknowledge, and that their wisdom survived through the people they taught. Throughout the ancient world, there are myths about wise teachers who appeared after a great flood. The Sumerians spoke of the Apkallu, fishmen who emerged from the sea and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Egyptians had legends of gods who walked among humans and taught them sacred knowledge. South American cultures spoke of Viracocha, a bearded teacher who arrived after a flood and taught people how to build, farm, and worship. These stories appear independently in cultures separated by thousands of miles. They all share common themes: a great catastrophe, usually a flood, a time of darkness and chaos, then the arrival of teachers, bringers of knowledge, who help humanity rebuild. Are these just myths, or are they memories distorted by time of real events? We know for certain that massive floods did happen at the end of the Ice Age. We know coastlines were drowned. We know populations were displaced. What we don't know is exactly who those displaced people were and what knowledge they carried. Göbekli Tepe appears right at this transition point in history. It was built around 9,500 years before the Common Era, just as the Ice Age was ending, just as sea levels were rising, just as the world was being transformed. The sudden appearance of such sophisticated architecture and art, with no apparent earlier development leading up to it, suggests the knowledge came from somewhere. The question is, where? One possibility is that it developed locally, that the hunter-gatherers in this region were simply more advanced than we give them credit for. They experimented, they learned, they innovated, and over time they developed the skills needed to build Göbekli Tepe. Another possibility is that knowledge came from outside, from refugees, travelers or teachers who brought skills from other places, perhaps places now lost to the sea. We may never know for certain, but what we do know is that 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans were capable of far more than we once believed. They could organize on a massive scale. They could work stone with precision. They could create art that still moves us today. And they did all of this during a time of global catastrophe, when their world was literally being reshaped by rising seas and changing climates. Perhaps adversity pushed them forward.
Perhaps the need to preserve their culture in the face of disaster drove them to build something permanent, something that would outlast the floods, something that would carry their beliefs and knowledge into the future. If that's true, then Göbekli Tepe is more than just a temple. It's a message from people who knew their world was ending, who wanted to make sure something of their culture survived. And after 11,000 years, we're finally beginning to understand that message.
The carvings at Göbekli Tepe aren't just random pictures of animals. Many researchers believe they're trying to tell us something. They're speaking to us across thousands of years, if only we can learn to listen. One of the most famous carvings is Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, sometimes called the Vulture Stone. This pillar has captured the imagination of archaeologists and researchers worldwide because it appears to contain a complex narrative, possibly even astronomical information. Let's look at what's carved on this mysterious pillar. At the top, along the upper edge, there are several H-shaped symbols arranged in a row. These abstract shapes appear throughout Göbekli Tepe, and no one knows exactly what they mean. Some researchers think they might represent buildings or doorways. Others believe they could be abstract representations of the T-pillars themselves. Below that, we see a large bird, probably a vulture, spreading its wings. The detail is remarkable. You can make out individual wing feathers, the curve of the bird's body, the position of its head. This isn't a simple stick figure bird. This is a vulture rendered by someone who had watched vultures closely, who understood how they look in flight. On the vulture's wing, there's a small circular disc. What does this disc represent? Some say it's the sun. Others argue it could be a head, perhaps relating to the headless man shown elsewhere on the pillar. Still others propose it might represent a celestial body, a comet, or a star of special significance. Near the vulture, we see other animals. A scorpion with its tail raised, an ibex, a type of wild goat, various birds in different poses, and then, at the bottom of the pillar, the headless man. This male figure is clearly depicted without his head. His body is shown in detail with certain physical characteristics emphasized, suggesting life and vitality. But where his head should be, there's nothing. The head is gone, and above him, the vulture spreads its wings. This scene has sparked intense debate. What story is being told here? One interpretation relates to burial practices. In several ancient cultures, including some in this region, the dead were not buried in the ground. Instead, their bodies were placed on platforms or in open areas where vultures and other scavenging birds would consume the flesh, leaving only bones behind. This practice, called sky burial or excarnation, was seen as a way for the deceased spirit to ascend to the heavens, carried up by the birds. Could the headless man represent someone who has died? Could the vulture be carrying his soul to the afterlife? This would suggest that Göbekli Tepe was a place associated with death rituals, a sacred space where the living came to honor the dead and ensure their safe passage to whatever comes next. But some researchers see something else in these carvings, a star map. This is where the theory gets really interesting. What if the animals carved on Pillar 43 aren't just animals? What if they represent constellations?
Let's consider the scorpion. In our modern night sky, there's a constellation called Scorpius, shaped roughly like a scorpion. It's one of the most recognizable constellations, especially visible from regions near the equator like Turkey. Now look at the other animals on the pillar. Could they correspond to other constellations? Some researchers have tried to match these carvings to star patterns that would have been visible in the night sky 11,000 years ago. Here's where it gets technical. The Earth wobbles on its axis over time, a phenomenon called precession. This wobble causes the positions of stars and constellations to shift gradually. Over thousands of years, the night sky looks different. Constellations that were visible in certain seasons 11,000 years ago appear in different seasons today. Using computer programs that can simulate the ancient night sky, some researchers claim they can match the carvings on Pillar 43 to constellations as they appeared around 10,900 years before the Common Era. If this is true, it raises enormous questions. How did the builders of Göbekli Tepe have such detailed astronomical knowledge? Why would they care about recording the positions of stars? One controversial theory suggests the carvings commemorate a specific astronomical event, a comet impact or meteor shower. Some researchers believe that around 12,900 years ago, a comet struck Earth or broke apart in the atmosphere, causing massive destruction and triggering a period of rapid climate cooling called the Younger Dryas. Could the carvings at Göbekli Tepe be a record of this catastrophic event? Could the builders have witnessed a comet in the sky, seen it strike Earth, and wanted to record that moment for future generations? This theory is hotly debated. Many mainstream archaeologists strongly disagree. They point out that the builders might have recycled pillars, moving them from one position to another over time, which would make astronomical alignments meaningless. They also note that the pillars might have been part of roofed structures, which would prevent them from serving as astronomical observatories.
Furthermore, there are more than 60 decorated pillars at Göbekli Tepe. If we're going to interpret one pillar as a star map, we need to interpret all of them consistently. And so far, no one has been able to do that convincingly. But even if the astronomical interpretations are incorrect, it's clear that the ancient builders were paying attention to the sky. Many ancient cultures were deeply aware of celestial patterns. The sun's daily journey, the moon's phases, the seasonal movements of stars. All of these were important for timing planting, hunting, migrations, and religious ceremonies. The builders of Göbekli Tepe lived under the same stars we see today. They watched the sun rise and set. They tracked the moon. They saw meteor showers and comets. And based on what we know, they incorporated that celestial knowledge into their sacred structures. Whether or not the pillars are literal star maps, they clearly held deep symbolic meaning. The fact that specific animals appear in specific enclosures suggests an organized symbolic system. The snakes in one circle, the foxes in another, the boars in a third. This isn't random decoration. This is intentional. This is communication. The pillars speak to us, not in words, but in images. And like any ancient language, we're still learning how to read it properly. Each year, as more of the site is excavated, we gain new insights, new pieces of the puzzle. Perhaps one day we'll fully understand what the builders were trying to say. Until then, the pillars stand as silent witnesses, holding their secrets, waiting for us to become wise enough to truly listen. When we look at the symbols and images carved into Göbekli Tepe, something remarkable becomes apparent. These aren't unique to this site. Similar images, similar styles, similar symbolic themes appear in other ancient cultures that came later. It's as if Göbekli Tepe was the source, the original, and its influence spread outward through time and space, showing up in later civilizations across the ancient world. Consider the T-shaped pillars themselves. These distinctive stone monuments, with their anthropomorphic forms suggesting a human body with head and shoulders, don't just appear at Göbekli Tepe. They appear at other sites in the region too. Places like Nivali Chori, a site that was unfortunately flooded when a dam was built. Places like Karahan Tepe, recently excavated and showing remarkable similarities to Göbekli Tepe. These sites form a cluster, all in the same region of southeastern Turkey, all from roughly the same time period. Archaeologists call this cluster the Taş Tepeler sites, and they all share that distinctive T-pillar architecture.
But the influence doesn't stop there. When we look at later civilizations, we see echoes. The Sumerians, who lived in Mesopotamia starting around 5,000 years ago, had a writing system that included symbols and icons. Some of these symbols bear a curious resemblance to images found at Göbekli Tepe. The H-shaped symbols, the arrangements of animals, certain abstract patterns. Is this just coincidence? Or did the Sumerians inherit some of their symbolic language from earlier cultures? Cultures that could trace their roots back to places like Göbekli Tepe. The ancient Egyptians, whose civilization emerged around 5,000 years ago, also used elaborate symbolic systems. Their hieroglyphs included many animal symbols: birds, snakes, scorpions, lions. The way they arranged these symbols, the meanings they attached to certain creatures, all of this echoes patterns we see in earlier sites. Snakes, for example, are prominent at Göbekli Tepe. They're also prominent in Egyptian symbolism, representing both danger and divine protection. The pharaoh's crown featured a cobra, the uraeus, symbolizing power and connection to the gods. Vultures, too, appear in both contexts. In Egyptian mythology, the vulture goddess Nekpet represented protection and motherhood, even though vultures are scavengers. The connection between vultures and the sacred, between these birds and the passage between life and death, seems to have very ancient roots. Lions, the ultimate predators, appear throughout ancient Near Eastern art and mythology. The lion-headed goddess Sekhmet in Egypt, the lion gates of Hattusa in Anatolia, the lions of Babylon. Could this reverence for lions trace back to the lion carvings of Göbekli Tepe? There's a theory that after the climate changed at the end of the Ice Age, after Göbekli Tepe was buried, the people who had gathered there dispersed. They spread out across the region, migrating to new areas, and they carried their beliefs and knowledge with them. As these groups settled in new places, they established new cultures. Over generations, the specific details changed. Languages evolved. Stories were retold and transformed. But certain core symbols, certain fundamental beliefs, persisted. Could Göbekli Tepe be the origin point of a symbolic tradition that eventually flowed into the later civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond? This is speculative, but it's based on real connections. The geographic proximity is clear. Göbekli Tepe sits in Upper Mesopotamia, not far from where the earliest Mesopotamian cities would later emerge. The timeline fits too. Göbekli Tepe was active from about 9,500 to 8,000 years before the Common Era. By 7,000 years before the Common Era, farming communities were well established in the region. By 5,000 years before the Common Era, the first cities were being built in Sumer. That's a long span of time, thousands of years. But cultural traditions can persist across millennia, especially if they're tied to religious beliefs and passed down through ritual practice. Think about it this way. Christianity is roughly 2,000 years old. Buddhism is about 2,500 years old. Hinduism has roots going back at least 3,000 years. These religions have survived across millennia because they're embedded in cultural practices taught
From generation to generation, preserved in sacred texts and rituals. If a religious tradition started at Göbekli Tepe, it could have survived in some form for thousands of years, evolving but never completely disappearing, eventually influencing the civilizations that came later. The spread of agriculture might have been the vehicle for this cultural transmission. When farming first began, it originated in this very region, the Fertile Crescent. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, lentils, and peas all grew naturally here. The wild ancestors of sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle lived here. When humans began domesticating these plants and animals, they created something revolutionary, a surplus of food. With that surplus came population growth, permanent settlements, and the time to develop complex culture. As farming techniques spread from the Fertile Crescent into surrounding regions, farmers carried more than just seeds and livestock. They carried stories, beliefs, and symbolic traditions. A farmer from a community that traced its ancestry back to the sacred hill might have taught not just how to plant wheat, but also which animals were sacred, which symbols had power, which stories explained the origins of the world. Over time, these beliefs would blend with local traditions, adapt to new environments, and transform. But the core might remain, like a river that changes course, but never completely dries up. This could explain why we see similar themes across such a wide area. The reverence for certain animals, the use of stone monuments to mark sacred spaces, the association between birds and the journey of souls, the importance of circular or enclosed sacred areas. These aren't universal human traits. Not every culture builds stone temples. Not every culture venerates vultures. Not every culture buries its sacred sites. These are specific cultural choices, and they had to come from somewhere. Göbekli Tepe might be that somewhere. The original source, the first cathedral, the birthplace of a symbolic tradition that would echo through millennia. Of course, this is interpretation based on patterns and possibilities. We can't prove direct cultural transmission from Göbekli Tepe to later civilizations without written records, and writing wouldn't be invented for another 5,000 years after Göbekli Tepe was built. But the patterns are there, the connections exist, and the more we study ancient sites across the Near East, the more we see threads that seem to connect back to this one hilltop
in southeastern Turkey.
Perhaps one of the most misunderstood aspects of Göbekli Tepe is what happened to it after it was built. For many years, researchers believed the site was deliberately buried on purpose by its builders. This dramatic story captured imaginations worldwide. But newer research has revealed a different, and in some ways more fascinating, truth. The original excavator, Klaus Schmidt, who worked at the site from 1995 until his death in 2014, initially believed the enclosures had been intentionally filled in with dirt and rubble. This seemed to make sense at first. The structures were completely covered, preserved under layers of material. Schmidt thought perhaps each generation built their circle, used it for ceremonies, and then ritually buried it when their time was done, building a new one nearby. This interpretation was dramatic. It suggested the builders deliberately hid their masterpiece, sealing it away like a time capsule. People wondered, why would anyone bury something so magnificent? Was it to protect sacred knowledge? Was it to hide power? Did they know something terrible was coming? But science is about constantly testing our ideas against new evidence. And when Lee Clare and his team, including architect Moritz Kinzel, took over excavations after Schmidt's death, they began looking more carefully at how the site was actually filled in. What they discovered changed the story completely. The site sits on a hillside. The circular enclosures are located in the lower, southeastern part of the site in a natural hollow. Above them, on higher ground, were other structures, including what appear to be rectangular dwelling buildings where people actually lived. Clare and Kinzel noticed something important when they dug down to bedrock. Many of the large central pillars in the circular enclosures were leaning, and they were all leaning in the same direction, as if something had knocked them off balance. They also found evidence that these buildings had been repaired and rebuilt multiple times. The pillars were stabilized, walls were reinforced. At one point, terrace walls were even constructed, apparently to try to prevent further damage. What could cause this kind of damage? The answer? Landslides and earthquakes. Göbekli Tepe is located in a region that still experiences earthquakes today. 11,000 years ago, the climate was different too, with more rainfall than we see in the area now. Heavy rains could have loosened soil and debris from the higher parts of the settlement, sending it sliding downhill. The circular enclosures, sitting in that natural hollow, would have been directly in the path of these landslides. Over time, debris from collapsing buildings higher up the hill, mixed with sediment, would have washed down and filled the enclosures.
This wasn't a one-time event. Based on what we know, it happened repeatedly over the centuries that Göbekli Tepe was in use. A landslide would partially fill an enclosure. The people would dig it out, repair the damage, stabilize the pillars, and continue using the space. Then another event would occur, and they'd have to repair it again. Eventually, around the late 9th millennium before the Common Era, a particularly severe landslide appears to have caused so much damage that at least some of the enclosures were finally abandoned. The effort to keep digging them out and repairing them simply became too much. This new understanding actually makes the site even more impressive. The people of Göbekli Tepe weren't just builders, they were maintainers. They cared about these structures enough to repair them over and over again, generation after generation, fighting against natural forces that were trying to bury their sacred spaces.
Of course, some filling might have been intentional too. When new structures were built on the higher parts of the site, the construction debris had to go somewhere. People may have dumped some of it downhill where it ended up in the older enclosures. This is what archaeologists call anthropogenic, or human-caused filling. But this would have been practical disposal of rubble, not a mysterious ritual burial. So the truth is more complex than the original story. The site wasn't dramatically buried all at once by people trying to hide it. Instead, natural processes, landslides caused by earthquakes and heavy rainfall, gradually filled in the structures over time. The builders fought back against this, repairing and maintaining their buildings, but eventually nature won. This doesn't make the mystery disappear, though. It raises new questions. Why did people build in a location that was prone to landslides? Did they not realize the danger at first? Or was there something about that particular spot, that natural depression in the hillside, that made it sacred despite the practical difficulties? And why did they keep coming back, repairing, rebuilding, refusing to abandon the site, even when it must have been clear that the location had problems? What made these circular enclosures so important that multiple generations invested enormous effort into maintaining them? The fact that people did eventually abandon the site, around 8,000 years before the Common Era, tells us that something changed. This could have been related to the natural disasters becoming too severe, but it also coincides with broader changes in the region. Agriculture was spreading. People were building permanent villages. The old way of life, the world of mobile hunter-gatherers gathering for seasonal ceremonies, was transforming into something new. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe represents the last stand of that older world. The monumental stone circles, maintained through incredible effort, even as nature tried to reclaim them, could be seen as a community's determination to hold on to their traditions, their beliefs, their connection to the sacred, even as everything around them was changing. In the end, they let go. The circles were abandoned. New kinds of settlements, new forms of life, new ways of relating to the sacred emerged. But thanks to those same natural processes that the builders fought back against, the landslides and debris that eventually buried the site, Göbekli Tepe was preserved. The pillars, protected under layers of earth, survived for 11,000 years in remarkable condition. So while the builders didn't bury their temple as a deliberate act of preservation, nature did, and that natural burial gift-wrapped this incredible site for us to discover millennia later. The story is less mystical than the idea of ritual burial, but it's more human. It shows us people struggling with real problems, making practical decisions, caring deeply about their sacred spaces, and ultimately being forced by circumstances to move on.
That's a story we can all understand, because it's the story of every generation, trying to preserve what matters while adapting to change. Around the world, separated by oceans and continents, different cultures tell remarkably similar stories. Stories of a great flood, stories of massive destruction, stories of a time when the world nearly ended and only a few people survived to rebuild. These aren't modern stories. These are ancient myths, some of the oldest stories humanity has preserved. And they all describe the same basic event, a catastrophic flood that reshaped the world. The most famous of these stories in Western culture is the biblical flood of Noah. According to Genesis, God decided to flood the earth because humanity had become wicked. Only Noah and his family were spared. God instructed Noah to build an ark, a massive boat, and fill it with pairs of every animal. Then the rains came, flooding the entire world, killing everything not on the ark. After the waters receded, Noah and his family repopulated the earth. But this story isn't unique to the Bible. In fact, it appears to be borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian mythology. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories in existence, includes a flood narrative that's strikingly similar to Noah's story. In this version, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Ea that the other gods plan to flood the earth. Utnapishtim builds a boat, loads it with his family, craftsmen, and animals, and survives the deluge. When the waters recede, he releases birds to check if land has emerged, just like Noah does.
In North America, many indigenous tribes have flood stories. The Ojibwe tell of Nanabujo, who survived a great flood sent by powerful spirits. The Hopi describe a world that was destroyed by water, with survivors emerging into a new world. Even in distant Oceania, Australian Aboriginal stories speak of a time when the sea rose and swallowed coastal lands, forcing people to flee to higher ground. These stories come from cultures that had no contact with each other. The ancient Sumerians didn't know about the Inca. The biblical Hebrews didn't communicate with indigenous Americans. The Greeks didn't learn from Australian Aboriginals. Yet they all tell the same story: a great flood, massive destruction, a handful of survivors, and the rebuilding of civilization afterward. Why? The traditional explanation is that floods are common natural disasters. Every culture experiences floods in rivers, coastal storms, tsunamis. So it makes sense that flood stories would appear in mythology. Humans tell stories about the dangers they face, and floods are universal dangers. But this explanation doesn't fully account for the specificity of these myths. These aren't stories about local floods that destroyed a village or two. These are stories about world-ending catastrophes, floods so vast they covered mountains, destroyed all of humanity except a chosen few, and fundamentally reset civilization. That's a very specific narrative, and it appears globally. Some researchers believe these myths preserve actual historical memories. At the end of the last ice age, between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet. This wasn't a single flood. It was a long-term process. But within that process, there may have been sudden catastrophic events. When an ice dam holding back a glacial lake breaks, millions of gallons of water can be released in hours or days. The result is a massive flood, far larger than any normal river flooding. These glacial outburst floods are well documented in the geological record. The channeled scablands of Washington State in the United States were carved by such a flood at the end of the Ice Age. The Missoula floods, as they're called, were caused by the breaking of a massive ice dam in Montana. The resulting wall of water was hundreds of feet high and traveled at highway speeds, scouring the landscape down to bedrock. Similar events could have happened elsewhere in the world. If such a flood struck a populated area, it would have been absolutely catastrophic from the perspective of the people living there. To them, it would have seemed like the entire world was drowning.
survivors would tell stories. Those stories would be passed down through generations, becoming more mythologized over time, but preserving the core memory of the disaster. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis suggests that the Black Sea, once a freshwater lake, was suddenly flooded when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus around 7,500 years ago. If there were settlements around the lake, which seems likely, those people would have experienced a devastating flood as the lake level rose rapidly, possibly by hundreds of feet in a short time. The Persian Gulf was once a fertile river valley. As sea levels rose, it was gradually flooded, becoming the body of water we know today. If early humans lived in that valley, and archaeological evidence suggests they did, they would have been displaced by rising waters over generations. Coastal areas around the world were drowned as glaciers melted. The English Channel, once a river valley, became a sea barrier separating Britain from Europe. These changes forced human populations to move. They disrupted established ways of life. They destroyed settlements and flooded hunting grounds. From the perspective of the people living through it, this would have been world-changing, civilization-ending catastrophe.
And this brings us back to Göbekli Tepe. The site was built right at this transitional moment in history. It dates to approximately 9,500 years before the Common Era, give or take a few hundred years. That places it squarely at the end of the Ice Age, during the period when sea levels were rising, when coastlines were changing, when the world, as humans had known it, was being transformed. Could Göbekli Tepe have been built by people who had experienced these catastrophes? By survivors of drowned coastal settlements who moved inland, bringing their knowledge and their memories with them? Could the sophisticated skills displayed at Göbekli Tepe have been inherited from an earlier coastal culture, now lost beneath the waves? This is speculation, but it's speculation based on real events. The floods happened, the sea levels rose, populations were displaced, and somehow, in the aftermath of all that change, humans built Göbekli Tepe, a temple complex so advanced it challenges everything we thought we knew about that time period. Perhaps the myths and the monuments are telling us the same story. Perhaps they're both evidence of a forgotten chapter of human history, a time when civilization rose, fell, and rose again, carrying forward whatever knowledge could be saved from the catastrophe. The survivors became the teachers became the gods of myth, and their lessons, preserved in stone and story, waited for us to rediscover them. The idea that an advanced civilization existed before recorded history and was destroyed by cataclysm isn't new. It's been proposed by researchers, writers, and alternative historians for decades. The most prominent modern advocate of this theory is British author Graham Hancock, whose books, including Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, have brought these ideas to millions of readers worldwide. Hancock's central thesis is this: during the Ice Age, a sophisticated civilization existed. This civilization had advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and possibly navigation. Around 12,800 years ago, a cosmic catastrophe, possibly a comet impact, struck Earth, triggering massive flooding, climate change, and the destruction of this civilization. A few survivors escaped the catastrophe. These survivors spread across the globe, bringing their knowledge to less developed human populations. They became the civilizing heroes of mythology, the wise teachers, the gods who came from the sea,
the bringers of knowledge. Over thousands of years, the knowledge brought by these survivors influenced the development of later civilizations. The precision stonework of Egypt, the astronomical knowledge of the Maya, the megalithic structures of Malta, all of these could trace their origins back to techniques taught by survivors of the lost civilization. Hancock points to Göbekli Tepe as evidence supporting his theory. Here we have a sophisticated temple complex built by hunter-gatherers appearing suddenly in the archaeological record without apparent developmental period. This fits the pattern of knowledge being introduced from outside rather than developing locally. It's important to note that mainstream archaeology strongly disputes Hancock's theories. Most professional archaeologists see no evidence for a lost Ice Age civilization. They argue that the sites Hancock discusses, including Göbekli Tepe, can be explained through the gradual development of human culture without needing to invoke a lost advanced civilization. However, Göbekli Tepe does raise questions that are difficult to answer within the traditional framework. First, there's the question of knowledge transfer. If the hunter-gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe developed their skills independently, where's the evidence of earlier, simpler attempts? We should see a progression, crude stone structures leading to more refined ones, eventually culminating in the sophistication of Göbekli Tepe. But we don't see that progression. Göbekli Tepe appears fully formed, with complex architecture and skilled artistry from the beginning. The earlier layers of the site, the oldest parts, are actually the most impressive. As time went on, the structures became simpler and cruder, not more sophisticated. This is the opposite of what we'd expect from a culture learning and improving over time.
Second, there's the question of astronomical knowledge. If the carvings at Göbekli Tepe do represent astronomical observations, as some researchers argue, that suggests a fairly sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Tracking star positions over long periods requires patient observation and record-keeping. It requires understanding that celestial patterns repeat on predictable cycles. For hunter-gatherers, living hand-to-mouth, focusing most of their energy on finding food, when would they have time for such detailed astronomical observation? And why would they care? Farmers need to know seasonal timing for planting. Sailors need stars for navigation. But why would pre-agricultural hunters need precise star knowledge? Unless they learned it from someone else. Someone for whom such knowledge had been important, perhaps for navigation across long distances or for maintaining a calendar system developed in an earlier time. Third, there's the global distribution of megalithic sites. Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Around the world, ancient cultures built massive stone structures that seem to exceed what we'd expect from their technological level. In Malta, the hypogeum of Hal Salfiene is an underground temple carved from solid limestone, featuring acoustic properties that suggest sophisticated understanding of sound. The temples of Malta, above ground, feature massive stones precisely fitted together, built around 5,000 years ago by a culture we know almost nothing about. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza demonstrates engineering precision that's difficult to explain, even with modern tools. The base of the pyramid is level to within inches across 13 acres. The sides are aligned to true north with minimal error. The stones, some weighing 70 tons, are fitted so precisely that you can't slip a knife blade between them. In South America, sites like Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman feature stones weighing hundreds of tons, cut with precision,
fitted together with complex interlocking shapes. Some stones have tool marks suggesting machine-level accuracy. How did these widely separated cultures, with no apparent contact, all decide to build massive stone monuments? How did they all develop the techniques to work enormous stones with precision? The conventional explanation is independent invention. Humans everywhere faced similar challenges and came up with similar solutions. Stone is durable and impressive. Every culture that wanted to build something permanent naturally turned to stone. The alternative explanation is diffusion. Perhaps knowledge spread from a common source. Perhaps techniques for working stone, for moving massive blocks, for achieving precision fits, were taught by people who already knew these skills, people who learned them from an earlier tradition. This doesn't require invoking aliens or impossible ancient technology. It simply suggests that human civilization might be older and more complex than we currently acknowledge. That there might have been advanced cultures during the Ice Age, cultures that lived along coasts now drowned, and that survivors from these cultures spread their knowledge after catastrophe struck. Göbekli Tepe sits at a crucial point in this debate. It's dated reliably, using multiple methods, to approximately 9,500 years before the Common Era. It's sophisticated, showing advanced planning and execution, and it appears in the archaeological record without clear predecessors. Does this prove Graham Hancock's theory? No. Science doesn't work on single pieces of evidence, and there are plenty of problems with the lost civilization hypothesis. If such a civilization existed, where are the cities? Where are the tools? Where are the countless artifacts that any civilization leaves behind?
The answer from alternative researchers is that those sites are now underwater, buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean where we haven't looked. And to be fair, underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive. Only a tiny fraction of the world's ocean floor has been thoroughly explored. But mainstream archaeologists counter that if a civilization was advanced enough to teach complex techniques to others, we should still find some trace of them somewhere. And so far, despite decades of looking, no such evidence has emerged. The debate continues, and Göbekli Tepe, instead of settling questions, has raised new ones. What we can say for certain is that human beings 11,000 years ago were more capable than we once believed. They could plan large projects, they could organize labor, they could create beautiful art, they could move massive stones, they could build structures that would last for millennia. Whether they learned these skills independently or inherited them from someone else remains an open question. But either answer is remarkable. Either we're discovering that humans could do amazing things far earlier than we thought, or we're discovering that there's a whole chapter of human history we haven't yet uncovered. Both possibilities are exciting. Both challenge us to keep looking, keep digging, keep asking questions. Because the past isn't finished teaching us. Not yet. The archaeological community is divided over Göbekli Tepe. Not about whether it's important. Everyone agrees it's one of the most significant discoveries of the last century. But about what it means, about how to interpret it, about what it tells us about ancient humanity. On one side are the mainstream archaeologists. These researchers have spent decades studying the Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and settled life.
They see Göbekli Tepe as an exciting discovery that expands our understanding, but doesn't fundamentally break the existing framework. In their view, Göbekli Tepe shows that pre-pottery Neolithic humans were more organized and capable than previously thought. The site demonstrates that complex social structures and religious practices could develop before agriculture, not after. This is significant, but it's not evidence of lost civilizations or outside intervention. These scholars point out that there are other pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the region, places like Chayuni, Nevali Chori, and Jerf el Ahmar, that show similar developments. Göbekli Tepe might be the most impressive, but it's not completely alone. It's part of a larger pattern of cultural development in the Fertile Crescent during this period. They also emphasize that the construction techniques at Göbekli Tepe, while impressive, aren't impossible to explain. Stone tools can shape limestone. Human labor can move heavy stones if you have enough people and patience. The carvings are beautiful, but not beyond the capability of talented stone carvers working with simple tools. Most importantly, mainstream archaeologists argue against the tendency to underestimate ancient humans. Just because people didn't have metal tools or written language doesn't mean they weren't intelligent, creative, or capable. Modern humans have had the same brain capacity for at least 50,000 years, maybe longer. The hunter-gatherers of 11,000 years ago were just as smart as we are. They could plan, organize, create, and innovate.
On the other side are the alternative researchers. These writers and investigators, including Graham Hancock, Robert Schoch, and others, see Göbekli Tepe as evidence that challenges mainstream history. They argue that the sudden appearance of sophisticated architecture without clear developmental stages suggests knowledge came from outside. They point to similar patterns at other ancient sites: precision without explanation, complexity without precedent, knowledge that seems ahead of its time. These researchers are often accused of not respecting the capabilities of ancient humans, but they counter that their theories actually give ancient humans more credit, not less. They're not saying ancient people were too dumb to build monuments. They're saying ancient humans were sophisticated enough to develop advanced civilizations during the Ice Age, civilizations we haven't yet fully discovered. The alternative view also questions why mainstream archaeology is so resistant to revisiting established timelines. After all, Göbekli Tepe itself proves that the old timeline was wrong. Before its discovery, textbooks said monumental architecture and organized religion came after agriculture, around 6,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe pushed that back more than 3,000 years and flipped the causation. If one major revision was necessary, why not others? Why is it so controversial to suggest there might be even earlier developments we haven't yet found? The tension between these camps sometimes gets heated. Mainstream archaeologists accuse alternative researchers of cherry-picking evidence, ignoring data that doesn't fit their theories, and promoting sensationalism over careful scholarship. Alternative researchers accuse mainstream archaeology of being dogmatic, refusing to consider evidence that challenges established narratives, and protecting careers and reputations by rejecting new ideas. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. What everyone can agree on is that Göbekli Tepe is far from fully understood. Only about 5% of the site has been excavated. There are at least 16 more stone circles buried beneath the surface. Each new excavation season reveals new details, new mysteries, new questions. Klaus Schmidt dedicated his life to excavating Göbekli Tepe. He passed away in 2014 while working at the site he loved. Before his death, he estimated it would take at least another 50 years to fully excavate and study the complex. New discoveries continue to emerge from the region. Karahan Tepe, located about 30 miles from Göbekli Tepe, was recently excavated and shows similar T-pillars and circular structures. This site might even be older than Göbekli Tepe, pushing the timeline back even further. Are we about to discover a whole network of interconnected sacred sites from the pre-pottery Neolithic? Other sites in the area show intriguing features too. Boncuklu Tarla has revealed stone structures and carved pillars. Harbasuan Tepe is being investigated. Each site adds pieces to the puzzle. The debate over Göbekli Tepe isn't going away. If anything, it's intensifying as more data becomes available.
And that's actually healthy. Science advances through debate, through questioning, through the constant testing of ideas against evidence. The worst thing that could happen would be for everyone to agree too quickly, to stop asking difficult questions, to settle into comfortable assumptions. Göbekli Tepe challenges us. It forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew about our ancestors. It reminds us that the past is deeper, more complex, and more mysterious than any textbook can capture. Whether you side with mainstream interpretations or alternative theories, one thing is clear. Göbekli Tepe matters. It's rewriting human history, and we're only just beginning to read what it has to tell us. The forgotten builders of Göbekli Tepe left us something precious, not just stones and carvings, but questions. Questions that make us think, wonder, and search for answers. Those questions keep us digging, keep us exploring, keep us connected to the deep mystery of where we came from and who we truly are. For 11,000 years, Göbekli Tepe waited beneath the earth, hidden and forgotten. The people who built it vanished into history, leaving no written records, no names, no faces we can recognize. But their work survived, their message, carved in stone, patient and permanent, waited for the day when we would be ready to receive it. That day came in 1994 when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt looked at a hill and saw something no one else had seen. Now, 30 years of excavation later, we're beginning to understand just how much we didn't know about our own past. Göbekli Tepe teaches us that civilization is older than we imagined, that religion might have come before cities, that ancient humans were capable of incredible achievements with nothing but stone tools, human muscle, and an unshakable vision of something sacred. But Göbekli Tepe also teaches us humility. For all our modern technology, for all our satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, we still can't fully explain this place. We still don't know who these people were. We still don't understand all their symbols. We still can't say for certain why they built this temple and then buried it. The mystery remains. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. History isn't finished. The story of human civilization isn't complete. There are still secrets buried beneath our feet, waiting for someone curious enough, brave enough, patient enough to uncover them. Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of history. It's the end of a story we have not yet discovered. A story of people who came before,
who lived, loved, worshipped, created, and ultimately vanished, leaving only whispers in stone. What if there are more sites like this scattered across the world, still hidden beneath hills and forests and deserts? What if the human story goes back even further, deeper, stranger than we've dared to imagine? The only way to find out is to keep looking, keep questioning, keep digging. The forgotten builders of Göbekli Tepe gave us a gift, the gift of mystery. And in pursuing that mystery, we honor them. Their names are lost, their faces are forgotten, but their work endures. And through their work, they live on, speaking to us across the vast gulf of time, reminding us that we are part of something much older and much larger than any one lifetime. Please like and subscribe and join us again as we uncover the next lost civilization. Because the past isn't dead, it's just sleeping, waiting to be awakened. And we've only just begun to listen.